This is Transcast from the Metrans Transportation Center. I'm Matt Kaplan. Jose Gomez Ibanez is one of the world's most respected experts on transportation issues. Dr. Gomez Ibanez is the Derek C. Bach Professor of Urban Planning and Public Policy at Harvard, where he holds a joint appointment at the Graduate School of Design and the John F. Kennedy School of Government. His books include Regulating Infrastructure, Monopoly, Contracts, and Discretion from the Harvard University Press. His research focuses on transportation, infrastructure, privatization and regulation, and urban economic development. Dr. Gomez Ibanez recently spent a very busy couple of days at the University of Southern California. I sat down with him in the few minutes he had between sessions with students and faculty at USC. Jose, thank you for joining us on Transcast.
My pleasure.
You are spending some time here at USC, and we are very glad to be able to get a few minutes with you for the Transcast today and talk to you a little bit about some of your areas of interest and expertise. Sadly, I missed out. We were going to watch via video conference your presentation at lunchtime today, but I do have the abstract. The first line is, infrastructure policy in the United States appears to be at an impasse. I don't think you'd get much argument there. Let me just start with the most important question. Do you see a solution?
That's a tough question. I think you can understand the impasse better than see the solution out of it. I think the impasse is that a lot of experts say we need to increase our spending on infrastructure, that we're falling behind and with bad consequences, but that the public just doesn't buy it, or at least doesn't buy it to the extent that they're willing to authorize the politicians to increase gas taxes or to raise tolls and the like. And in that sense, I think the infrastructure crisis is not a financing crisis in the sense that we don't have the ability to borrow. We don't have the ability to repay. We're not willing to pay more for infrastructure, and if you won't pay more, you can't borrow more.
But this is in spite of bridges collapsing, and other clear problems like the kind of congestion that we face here in Los Angeles. Are we not selling this to the public well enough?
Well, I think we're sending mixed messages to the public. And in particular, you have the bridge collapse in Minneapolis set against the bridge to nowhere in Alaska. And if you look at the statistics, the earmarking is increasing in our highway and mass transit programs. In the last couple of years, I think 28% of the federal mass transit spending was earmarked, and 15% of the highway spending was earmarked. And the people who are critical of earmarking say that's leveraged, right? The earmark doesn't pay for 100% of the cost of a project, and so the effect of the earmarking on actual spending is greater. Now, I don't know. I just don't know whether the public is that attentive to it, but if on the media every time they talk about the highway bill or the transit bill, they refer to it as pork laden, it's got to have some impact.
It strikes me as one of those areas that seems to be treated with almost a magical attitude by the public that these things should simply happen.
Well, and there's always the desire to get something for nothing too. That we should get this infrastructure and we shouldn't have to pay for it.
These are major topics here in California, of course. We know that we have tremendous infrastructure challenges, and a state that is, I think at last count, $42 billion in debt this year. We don't even know yet how bad it's going to be next year. Stimulus package, everybody's very excited about the billions that will be flowing out fairly soon from D.C. But I did hear an economist say that the initial optimism that a lot of those billions would be going toward transportation infrastructure has been diverted to other needy causes. Is that something that you've been following? And do you think that's a mistake if it's true?
I think they're spending about as much on infrastructure in the stimulus package as they could responsibly do. My understanding is that there's about $60 billion in all kinds of infrastructure, including water and high-speed rail and so on. And about 30 of that, about half of it is highways. And when you recognize that federal highway spending is probably around $40 billion in a normal year, you're talking about effectively doubling or nearly doubling the spending And that's a lot for the system to absorb quickly and put out quickly. Were the 30 billion, 100 billion, it would be hopeless. And even at just 30 billion, I suspect that the system is going to have a hard time putting out worthwhile projects rapidly enough to have an effect.
You have looked extensively and around the world at privatization, private development as an option, as an alternative to tax-supported public sector development. And the article that I read, actually it was a review of your book published in 2003, Regulating Infrastructure, Monopoly, Contracts, and Discretion, where you talked about, it looked like 4 different levels of approach to privatization, but that you have seen, continue to see privatization as a very worthwhile alternative.
I think privatization has a lot to offer, but it also has a lot of risks. I think the advantage of privatization is that private investors and managers are very focused on performance, on particular dimensions of performance, profit primarily. And if you can harness that focused accountability, that focused incentives for public purposes, that can be very good. But you have to recognize that the profit-maximizing tariff or the profit-maximizing level of investment may not be the socially desirable tariff or the socially desirable level of investment, that public and private interests may diverge a little bit because of issues of monopoly in the case of infrastructure or environmental impacts or social equity. And so you need to structure the participation and the contracts under which they participate so that it becomes profitable for them to do what's socially desirable.
Are there parallels here to what we've seen happening in the financial markets in the last couple of years? The swing from deregulation to, well, maybe regulation is not such a bad thing, but we don't want to interfere too much with the market.
Well, I think in the case of infrastructure, we've always recognized that there has to be some public involvement. First, let me back up and say that private participation in infrastructure may seem a little exotic in the case of highways, but it's actually the norm in a lot of other kinds of infrastructure. It's important to understand that the energy sector, the electricity sector, the telecommunications sector, and so on have long been private in the United States, have always been private, and have functioned reasonably well. And that the level of investment in those sectors probably rivals or exceeds the level of investment in the highway sector. That being said, I think in areas like electricity, we've always recognized that there are elements of monopoly power, that the electric company that runs the wires down your street has you at their mercy to some degree because it's unlikely that a second electric company is going to be able to run wires down the street and offer competition. The same for the gas company and the public water company.
And we all remember Enron in this state.
And we, as well, one should. And so we've always understood in the utility business that the private interest may not always be consistent with the public interest, and that you want to have some regulation to make sure that, in particular, monopoly power is not misused by these utilities.
Are there successes that you can point to in the studies that you've done as you've looked around the world at where privatization, particularly in the transportation sector, highway infrastructure, has worked out well?
I think the advantages of private participation in infrastructure that you can see are of a couple types. One of them is innovations in the service levels or in the form of infrastructure provided. One of the most interesting innovations in transportation infrastructure, for example, is high occupancy toll lanes, where you have lanes, special lanes that are free for carpools, but also are available for toll-paying passengers who want to save time. And effectively, the toll payers finance the lanes for the carpools. This idea really was first applied here in California by one of the first private toll roads in the United States in the modern era, State Route 91 in California. And I don't think it's an accident that the first application of this idea, the first development of this idea, came with a private toll road rather than a public agency. The incentive for profit really motivated them to look for an opportunity that other people had overlooked. I also think that some of these toll roads that are managed by state and local governments in the United States are not as well managed as they would be by a big toll road operator that has experience and expertise of operating roads all over the country or all over the world. In Europe and Australia, there are some where private toll roads are much more common. There are some very big operators that are very sophisticated, and it's not hard to imagine that they would do a better job than, say, the Pennsylvania Turnpike Authority or even the California Department of Transportation in maintaining and managing a toll road.
I was in Florida last week, and I can't say that I was terribly impressed with what I saw of the toll infrastructure there. Some of the roads were in very good shape, but the toll plazas. Technology plays a role in this as well, I think, and I know that I'm much happier now when I drive that stretch of the 91 that you mentioned, because I'm not going to have to stop and fish out change. I have a transponder on my windshield, and I saw that the vast majority of drivers were enjoying that same advantage in Florida.
I'm not an expert on the evolution of electronic tolling, but my impression is, and I could be wrong, that the Europeans were more advanced than the United States in that, and that I suspect that that's partly because Europe has a lot of private toll roads and the United States does not. It was much more common to see electronic toll collection 10 years ago in Europe than it was in the United States.
Could you see this kind of privatization of highways extending beyond the regional level, where we have it here in Southern California in a very limited fashion, to the scale of, let's say, the interstate system?
I could. I actually think that the big benefit from privatization or private participation would come if you could give long-term contracts to manage the existing segments of the interstate system. Let's face it, we have congestion and we need to build more new highways, but the opportunities to do that are limited. The new highways that you might want in Los Angeles would be very expensive to build and would cause a lot of environmental damage. And so we're going to rely primarily on our existing highway infrastructure rather than new infrastructure for the decades to come. And that infrastructure is falling into disrepair. Managing those facilities, contracts to manage them, would probably be desirable.
I want to come back before we leave this topic to the public and political challenges. And again, in California, there is enormous resistance, at least in Southern California, to the concept of toll roads. Now, at least in San Francisco, they're used to paying for the use of those nice bridges up there. But here, even people who use them, and I must admit, I feel a bit of this as well, even though I have that transponder, there is this almost a sense of a God-given right that those roads should be, I can get on at a ramp and nobody's going to charge me to use it. And barely any sense that I'm paying for it. It's just that I don't have to fork over some change when I get on the road.
Well, there is a sense in which the motorist is right, that they did pay for those roads with fuel taxes. But I think the fuel tax is a difficult instrument to use to manage congestion. The fuel tax amounts to essentially a tax that is constant no matter when and where you drive. Because fuel and consumption varies a little with speed and stop-and-go driving, but not all that much. And if you want to motivate people not to use the highways in the peak hours to spread their travel out a little bit, for example, then you need a tax that varies by location, or user charge rather, that varies by location and time of day. I think it would be very possible to design a tolling system that was revenue neutral, that didn't actually extract more from the motorists than the current gas tax system, but which made the highway system perform much better by reducing congestion in its worst hours. When you think of it, the highway system is one of the few places that we don't use peak hour or peak period pricing and user charges to tame the peak. If you think about the airlines or the hotel industries, where they have a similar problem with congestion at the peak, they give you financial incentives to come during the off-peak, to come visit or fly when the facilities are underused, instead of everybody crowding at one time in one place.
Are you familiar with the Pier Pass system here in the Long Beach port, which does exactly this? It incentivizes truckers to use off-peak hours. It has certainly been a success on some levels. There is still some resistance to it. People along the 710 freeway that leads to Long Beach port are not thrilled to have trucks up there in more hours than they used to be. But it has met with some success. When you look at commercial traffic like that, commercial trucking, can that be approached in the same way as the passenger traffic, me and my little Prius going down the 91?
I don't see why not. I mean, in many ways, they have as much routing and schedule flexibility as the private motorist does. One of the interesting things, the most comprehensive effort to manage congestion using pricing in a developed country is the London congestion charging experience. And there they imposed a £5 entry fee on both cars and trucks entering central London during the rush hour, actually during the entire day. And the charge had a very dramatic effect on cars and a substantial, although slightly less dramatic effect on trucks. They could find opportunities to, say, consolidate loads so that they only had to make one trip a day into the center instead of two, or to route themselves around the center of London. In fact, I think many transportation planners were surprised at how responsive demand was, how much ability there was on the part of both private motorists and trucks to change their behavior.
Hasn't Mayor Bloomberg proposed something similar for New York City?
He did, and it was rejected by the New York State Legislature. I think in part because the scheme was not as carefully designed as London's was, and in part because Mayor Bloomberg, for all his skills as a politician, didn't put as much effort into selling it carefully as Mayor Livingston in London did.
Back for a moment at least to privatization. Is it one size fits all, or are there different approaches for different societies, communities, for making this work effectively?
I think in developing countries, the case for using the private sector is both stronger and weaker. It's stronger in the sense that their investment needs are much greater than ours. You know, we may complain about congestion, but we don't have congestion on the order of magnitude that a developing city like Jakarta or Ho Chi Minh City or Mumbai does. So the need for that massive investment and the desire to make that investment efficiently really is a strong advantage for private participation in it. At the same time, the case is a little weaker because the ability of the public administration to oversee the private concessionaires is a little weaker as well. As I said earlier, you need to protect the public interest in these facilities, particularly because they have elements of monopoly power and they're long-lived and durable investments. So having a public sector that can write concession contracts and administer concession contracts that are fair to both the investors and the public is important, and that capability is a little harder to find in developing countries than industrialized.
Mm-hmm. Before we run out of time, I want to turn to another area that you've spent a good deal of time studying and writing about, and that's urbanization, which is a process that continues at a mad pace in many parts of the world. Is certainly related to what we've been talking about, deeply related. Do you see this as something where the world and especially developing nations are just getting themselves into more and more trouble, or are there bright points of, what was the phrase that George Bush uses? Points of light. Thank you. Are there points of light on the global map that we should be paying attention to?
I think this whole issue of cities and infrastructure is fascinating. Cities are the engines of economic growth. With economic growth comes urbanization, and cities produce more per capita than rural areas because concentrations of labor and capital in urban areas are more productive than they are in rural areas. But maintaining that concentration, the downside of that concentration is congestion and pollution and the competition for centrally located space. And infrastructure is the tool we have to mediate that congestion and pollution and spatial competition. So having a good set of infrastructure policies, I think, is important to the smooth functioning of cities. And the smooth functioning of cities is important to economic growth. That being said, I think it's a fascinating question as to how much infrastructure you need and when, and how to accommodate it, given that infrastructure often displaces people and causes social disruption. And you see very different approaches in the developing countries. In India, for example, up until recently, they've been underinvesting in urban infrastructure by a great degree. The cities have been growing without much investment in highways or rail lines in the urban areas, with consequent congestion and very high rents in centrally located spaces and the like. Whereas China, it's almost a case of infrastructure-led growth for a variety of reasons. Their cities, particularly Shanghai and Beijing and the richer cities on the coasts, are investing in infrastructure almost ahead of demand, building rapid expressway systems and rail transit lines. And so you wonder whether there's some happy balance, whether India is underinvesting and China is overinvesting, and there might be some wonderful harmonic balance in between them.
That gets to my next question. Are there lessons in these developing nations, rapidly urbanizing nations, for those of us in the so-called first world?
Well, it's striking, if you think about the productivity of our cities, that we've stopped making the kinds of investments, by and large, have stopped making the kinds of investments that promote the accessibility of the center, that relieve congestion in the metropolitan areas, in part because the community opposition and environmental controversy for building new facilities is so great that as a practical matter, these facilities would be prohibitively expensive or politically impossible. And we may pay the consequences for that, but the developing countries are like we were decades ago, in that they can build some of these facilities and have the environmental consequences be damned, or the community disruption and relocation be considered a reasonable cost for the benefit that society as a whole achieves. They can break some eggs now, and they're busy doing it.
We're out of time. I thank you very much for taking a few minutes out of this visit to USC to join us for the MetTrans Transcast.
It was my pleasure.
This has been a MetTrans Transcast. MetTrans is funded by the United States Department of Transportation and the California Department of Transportation, Caltrans. We hope you'll join us for the next edition of Transcast.